Salem Witch Trials are one of the darkest episodes in American history, and the tale of one Giles Corey is the only proof we need to confirm that sadistic opportunism, bloodlust, and sheer stupidity were the sole causes of it. You see, fear is an infection, one that has been used and abused by men since the very beginning of time. When any perceived threat is left unattended for too long, it becomes the perfect opportunity in the eyes of the wicked. One that unites people in a blind, single-minded pursuit of destruction, akin to a bull chasing after a red rag. Now, my friend, we are in context. This is the scenario in which our story occurs. The year is 1692. Witch hunts were aplenty, and as previously mentioned, mass hysteria was the word. It was an all-around shitstorm in Salem, since there was no real way to prove that someone was a warlock or a witch. All accusations relied exclusively on words, which basically means that whether a person got to live or die solely depended on the number of friends they could gather to say otherwise. You can already tell that this system was deeply flawed, because if you had enough money or charisma, you could simply get a crowd to accuse anyone you didn't like of being a witch, effectively using the law itself to get rid of them. And Giles Corey was a man nobody liked. A prosperous landowning farmer living in Salem Village. He was born in England and later traveled to America as a young man, where he achieved success shortly after. He relished in his wealth and made sure that everyone knew how superior he was. Described as a rotten man, callous, cruel, and antisocial, he had unsurprisingly made many enemies in the village. And make no mistake, he was guilty of far more than being an asshole. Have you ever heard of indentured labor? This was a refined form of slavery quite prominent at the time. You had to work long, harsh hours without salary or any other form of payment, but with the caveat of only having to do so for a set period of time. Simply put, slavery with an expiration date. Giles Corey, being a successful landowner, had many indentured laborers at his service, and being true to his reputation, he grinded them to the dirt. Poor working conditions, no breaks, and constant hazing were part of the usual routine, as they were the brutal beatings he imparted as punishment. Any meager mistake, like slowing down or stopping for a few minutes due to exhaustion, could be enough grounds to warrant a pummeling. Yet the worst of these instances arrived in 1676. Jacob Goodale, one of the workers, was caught stealing an apple. Corey beat him to death with a stick in front of everyone, farmers and neighbors alike. A single apple was worth more than this man's life to Giles Corey. He was put on trial for this, and due to the several witnesses that testified against him, he was found guilty. But he was not convicted for murder. This is the 1600s we're talking about. Beating slaves was legal. In the eyes of the law, they were seen as lesser beings. So instead, he was charged with the use of excessive force and got away with a fine and a stern warning. He got away with it. Or at least, that's what it seemed. For after this incident, his violent death had already been set in stone. Giles Corey was not a good man. And I must repeat myself, Giles Corey was not an innocent man. His hands sullied with blood, and his back arched due to the burden of the many lives he had ruined. Yet what was about to happen to him makes statesmen like these lose their weight. In April 1692, at the age of 81, Giles Corey was put on trial, charged on account of being a witch. His accusers were many, and they shared the same testimony, which in my own words was something like this. A specter in the form of Giles Corey came to me, carrying a book. He beat me repeatedly about the head and back. Afterwards, he commanded that I write in his book. He said the pain would stop if I wrote in his book. I refused, for I did not want to be part of the machinations of the devil, and he responded by beating me harder while whispering insults and horrible things in my ears. The crowd gasped and screamed as they heard this. Corey stood atop a wooden platform in the center of the courtroom with his hands restrained, surrounded by 100 faces distorted by hate. Looking down on him, from a tall chair behind the desk, was the judge. A barrage of accusations started raining all over him. What are you hiding? Have you been in contact with demons? Why did your apparition hurt these people? One after the other, they were unrelenting. And whenever he tried to deny them, a member of the jury would feign seizures. Whenever he looked at anyone in the crowd, they would pretend to pass out. Why must you perform witchcraft at this very trial? Why do you keep on lying? Asked the judge. It was at this moment that it became clear to Giles that no matter what he said, he would be declared guilty. Everyone had already made up their minds from the beginning. The trial was just a formality, a cruel mockery. How do you plead? Asked the judge. Suddenly, all the noise in the room stopped. There are only two possible answers to this question. You either plead guilty or not guilty. Yet Giles Corey made a decision that would change American history forever. He looked straight into the eyes of the judge defiantly and stood mute. He refused to plead. And he did so knowing full well the consequences of this action. Painful adieu. Hard and forceful punishment. This law effectively grants the state the right to commit torture. You see, a person who refused to plead could not be legally tried. So in order to avoid criminals from just being able to walk away after saying nothing, this law was implemented as a deterrent, for it meant a fate worse than death. A punishment so brutal and painful that made hanging look like an act of mercy. Death by pressing. Giles Corey was forced to lay on the ground naked, bound by chains. Thick wooden boards were laid upon his chest and several large, heavy rocks were placed on top of them, the number of rocks slowly increasing over time. Each time the pressure increased, Corey was asked to make a plea, but his only answer was, "More weight." This lasted for almost 3 days until he eventually died. The man never cried, never screamed. All he said during the entire procedure were those 2 words, "More weight." This is the only instance in which a man endured this punishment without ever screaming in the entire history of the United States. But the question remains, why did he do it? Even if he was sentenced to hang at the gallows, that would surely be much better than dying by pressing. And Corey was aware that this would happen. It wasn't just an impulsive act born out of spite, no. It was a carefully calculated decision. And I'm going to tell you exactly what makes a man choose to die by pressing. The only wealth in this world is children, more than all the money or power on earth. Mario Puzo. Giles Corey married 3 times. And although we can't say he ever cared much for any of his spouses, he truly loved his children, and for their sake, he was willing to endure a fate worse than death. You see, at the time of the witch trials, if a person was declared guilty and then executed, their lands would be passed on to the state and not to their family. effectively leaving them with nothing. Corey had always known this, and by refusing to plead, he technically could not be declared guilty. Therefore, his land could not be seized by the state. His children would inherit it instead. They would be safe. It's up to you to decide if he deserved the punishment he got. Only you can choose whether to remember him as a martyr or as a villain. But what I can tell you, with certainty, is that this rotten man died with a smile on his face, tranquil, with the knowledge that his last wish would be granted.